I drove cattle to Rocky Flats up to 49. We drive them right up South Boulder Road and along the edge of Louisville and up the top of the hill and cut over to the Superior and go on up Coal Creek.
The father wasn't working his teams thrashing. He put them on and hauled freight. And hay that time was very high price. And he used to freight to Cheyenne.
We were raised that if we didn't have the money to buy something, we didn't get it. My folks never had a grocery charge bill. They always had a credit coming from the butter and eggs that they took over to trade.
The year was 1858. In the eastern United States, financial depression and the threat of civil war cast dark shadows over the land. But hundreds of miles away, at the foot of the Rocky Mountains, gold had been discovered along Cherry Creek. This event promised a new beginning for those willing to risk the long journey across what had been described as the Great American Desert. In Nebraska, a small group of farmers and merchants gathered to plan such a journey. None were miners by profession, but all were intent upon improving their lot. Some planned to settle permanently in the West, while others hoped to strike it rich and return home to their families. In September 1858, under the leadership of Captain Thomas Aikens, the 23 men of the Nebraska City Party headed west, toward the Rocky Mountains. At their first glimpse of the snowy peaks rising in the distance, they abandoned their plans to continue on to Cherry Creek. Instead, they turned toward Boulder Canyon. By October, they had arrived at the base of the Red Rocks, in what was later to become Boulder City and Boulder County. Against a backdrop of foothills and high peaks to the west, the men observed the barren landscape they had just crossed. A short grass prairie stretched far to the east, punctuated only by isolated shrubs and trees growing along the stream banks. They had passed large herds of buffalo, elk, and antelope. These were a welcome sight, since the wild game could augment their food reserves during the coming winter months. The flour, dried fruit, sugar, and coffee they had brought with them would have to be carefully rationed until the arrival of freight wagons from the States. Within days, the men began the trek up Sunshine Canyon to continue their search for gold. Although explorer Major Stephen Long had described this region as totally unfit for cultivation, members of the Nebraska City Party wrote letters home describing its agricultural potential. The fact that the winter of 1858 was mild probably influenced their initial perception. As those who followed were soon to discover, however, it would take more than mild weather to convert this arid prairie into cropland. Immigrants poured into Colorado Territory, traveling in wagon trains for protection from Indian attack. Many families faced their first winter here with no feed for their livestock. Reluctantly, they turned their cattle loose to survive as best they could on the dried prairie grasses. Because of the dry climate, the western wheat, blue grama, and buffalo grasses in the west retained their nutrients even during the winter months. Spring roundup found the trail-worn animals in healthy condition. The Homestead Act of 1862 granted 160 acres of free land to any adult who would live on it and cultivate it for 5 years. The land could then be proved up by paying a $6 commission fee. This made it possible to establish a family farm in Colorado Territory at relatively little expense. Even as late as 1900, farmland in Boulder County was selling for only $10 to $25 an acre.
So we started from Illinois the 7th day of May and got here the 1st day of August in '65. Came through Denver and we camped there for a day or two, and then we came on up to Boulder and we camped out on the Hank Green farm, which is now the Martin Acres. And there's a natural spring there, and my father had camped there when he came up in '64. And so we camped there that night, and then in the morning we hooked up and came into Boulder.
The Homestead Act also offered a timber culture right, an additional 160 acres for only $14 more. In exchange, the homesteader was required to plant 2,700 trees on 10 acres of his land. At the end of 5 years, he could take final possession if at least 675 trees were still thriving. Many of these trees eventually became firewood, fence posts, and building materials. Only traces of early timber claims remain in the county today. Some land speculators, like William Davidson, used the Homestead Act to enhance their own wealth.
The old man had acquired a large portion of land 8 miles east of Boulder, in the Boulder Creek Valley. There were dark hints by some as to how he had acquired the land. Some said he had brought roving young men in who had homesteaded, turning the land over to him. Flora Ewing.
The abundance of trees and stone in the county provided ample building materials for the settlers' first homes and outbuildings. But until the establishment of sawmills, dimension lumber for flooring or framing had to be whipsawn. This required placing a log over a pit. While one man stationed himself on the log, another stood in the pit below. Together, at either end of a two-man saw, they cut the log lengthwise into boards. Within a year, numerous sawmills were producing construction lumber. Most were temporarily erected near a stand of trees, then moved as the trees were cleared. Farmers often loaded lumber onto their wagons for the return trip home after delivering hay and feed to the mountains. Wooden barns were common throughout the county. The large Thronson barn west of Longmont accommodated the family's Clydesdale breeding operation, as well as the storage of hay. Alva Dodd's barn on Niwot Road was large enough to house 20 horses and 20 cows during its heyday. Al Schofield built a 3-story cement barn north of Lafayette in 1904. Its thick walls maintained an almost constant temperature, winter and summer. Nels Anderson introduced the first slip-form concrete silos to Boulder County in 1907. They were constructed in layers, using wooden forms he had brought from Minnesota. As each layer of concrete hardened, the form was raised, and another layer poured until the desired height was attained. Both silos are still standing today, south of Haystack Mountain.
My dad built a poured concrete silo, something like that. Yeah. Remember when they poured that thing? Because they hauled the sand from over in the gulch off Table Mountain.
By 1918, there were 88 silos in Boulder County. The last remaining wooden silo stands on the Stuart Anderson farm. Dating from the 1920s, it was constructed by his father, Ewald Anderson, who farmed east of Boulder.
A stave silo is composed of slabs of concrete measuring about 10 inches by 30 inches. It was just like laying bricks, only standing a 30-inch brick on edge. But those iron rings around them to squeeze it together and hold it tight.
Agricultural settlements appeared in the Boulder and St. Vrain valleys as early as 1860. While Boulder City functioned primarily as a supply town for miners, Valmont, Burlington, and Pella provided services to the growing farm population. Like most communities in the county, Valmont was located beside a creek, Boulder Creek. Its first commercial building was Tommy Jones's Hotel and Stage Stop, built of whipsawn lumber. Valmont soon had other businesses catering to local farmers, a feed store, blacksmith shop, the county's first newspaper, the county's first Grange Hall, and the first Presbyterian church to be built in Colorado Territory. Burlington formed around Alonzo Allen's cabin at the confluence of Left Hand and St. Vrain Creeks. This was the point at which the Cherokee Trail crossed the St. Vrain and was known as the Lower Crossing. In the 1860s, the Overland Stage Line crossed here on its way from Denver to Laramie and Salt Lake City.
My grandfather drove a stagecoach from Denver to Cheyenne, I know that. And the bridge down here over St. Vrain River was a pole bridge at that time. It was Burlington south of the river. And I've heard Grandpa say that they stayed all night there and then would take on and go to Fort Collins. And they had to do it in hitches because the horses got too tired.
While stagecoaches rumbled north toward Wyoming, travelers doing business in Valmont or Boulder headed west across Gun Barrel Hill, following the only road connecting Burlington with those settlements. Although the three communities competed politically with one another, it was Boulder that became the county seat and successfully laid claim to the state university. Homesteaders continued to pour into the St. Vrain Valley. In 1871, the Chicago colony purchased land directly north and across the creek from Burlington, establishing the community of Longmont. Because the north bank of the creek was higher and less prone to flooding, Burlington residents gradually moved their homes and businesses there. Further to the west, Pella formed near the upper crossing where travelers on the Laramie Trail forded St. Vrain Creek. One of the first settlers in Pella was George Webster, who arrived in 1860 after a brief attempt at gold mining near Central City. Shortly thereafter, Matthew McCaslin moved his family to the upper crossing after selling his interest in the Horsefall mine in Gold Hill. Altona wasn't planned as an agricultural town, but eventually became one. It was platted at the mouth of Left Hand Canyon to serve as a toll gate for a road leading to Gold Hill and Central City. Tolls were charged for the passage of all livestock, pack animals, and horse-drawn wagons. Farmers driving cattle to summer range above Altona were charged 5 cents a head to use the road. The toll road was completed to Gold Hill, but construction money played out, and it never reached Central City. By 1870, there was no further need for a toll gate, but local farmers were already relying on Altona for their supplies. The town disappeared years ago. Only the schoolhouse remains just west of the town site. Unlike the earlier towns that were settled beside streams, Niwot straddled the Colorado Central Railroad tracks, midway between Longmont and Boulder. There, it served as a shipping point for local crops and livestock. At the turn of the century, most of Niwot's businesses moved to the east side of the tracks, where they remain today. In recognition of its agricultural heritage, and because it has retained many of its historic buildings, Old Town Niwot was designated a county historic district in 1993. When Congress created Colorado Territory in 1861, several farm organizations were formed to influence new legislation as it was being written. On the national level, steps were also being taken to promote agriculture in the West. In 1862, President Lincoln signed legislation creating land-grant colleges, and Congress established experimental research stations. These efforts did little, however, to help American farmers battle price fixing and the high interest rates being charged by the railroads. Until the National Grange was founded in 1867, farmers seemed destined to remain voiceless and geographically isolated. The Grange movement, also known as patrons of husbandry, gave farmers a stronger political voice in legislative matters. While much of its ceremony is patterned after Masonic ritual, one major distinction is the participation of its women. The Grange was one of the earliest fraternal organizations allowing women to hold office. Boulder County welcomed the Grange movement, and within 4 years had organized its first local Grange, which met upstairs in this building in Belmont. In all, 24 Granges were organized in the county, most of them before 1915. Through the years, the Grange has continued to educate farmers about local and national issues. As a result of its political influence, transportation monopolies were controlled. The Department of Agriculture was created, and pure food legislation was enacted. Few families settling in Colorado were prepared for the dry land conditions which awaited them. Many had been lured west by fraudulent claims of a mild climate and ample water. Settlers soon discovered, however, that after spring rains had subsided, only dry land crops could survive without supplemental water. Therefore, land along streams was settled first. Families arriving later claimed adjacent land and dug ditches to divert the water onto their fields. Ditches were registered with the territorial government and prioritized according to their date of registry. The earliest were granted senior water rights, entitling them to the first available water. Junior rights received water only after the others had been served. In dry years, this sometimes meant no water at all. Lower Boulder Ditch, the first to divert water from Boulder Creek, was registered on October 1st, 1859. The following year, decrees were filed on the remaining creeks in the county. Within 5 years, there were 88 registered ditches. Horse-drawn scrapers were used to dig the earliest ditches. Creating the proper slope was essential to ensure that water flowed slowly and steadily to all portions of a field.
My granddad helped dig that Table Mountain ditch around there. It came down past our place, you know.
Enforcement of water rights didn't become necessary until the demand for water increased. In 1879, a state water commission was created, and commissioners were appointed to oversee all of the water districts throughout Colorado. Hiram Prince became commissioner for District Number 6, which still encompasses most of Boulder County. Disputes over water rights have existed since the first ditches were dug. For their own safety, some water commissioners wore badges and carried guns. Considerable ingenuity was applied by some farmers to ensure a steady supply of irrigation water once their headgates were opened. Pitchforks became weapons. Hatchets were wielded to destroy neighbors' headgates, and weeds were stuffed into others to plug them up. One farmer placed a beehive on his own headgate so that no one could turn it off during the night.
Just from what little I've been on the ditch, there's been disputes. Not from the old timers that's here, from the new ones that's moved in. And they always said somebody will steal water that wouldn't steal anything else.
Like a roll call of early pioneers, many ditches today have retained the names of those who dug them years ago. The Hinman Ditch, Goodhue Ditch, Leggett Ditch, Davidson Ditch, Haldeye Ditch, and the Zweck Ditch west of Longmont. The Homestead Act was widely advertised both in America and in Europe. The promise of free land lured many European immigrants to America.
Mother was 13 years old when she come across the plains to Niwot. And she and her sister walked about all the way, I guess, driving the cows. And when they came to the South Platte River down at Platteville, it took them 2 weeks to cross it. They had to take the wagons all to pieces. The boats wasn't big enough only to haul but a wheel at a time. Carl Knaus.
Although some families brought elderly parents with them to Colorado, and others were accompanied by friends or relatives, most women felt isolated from loved ones back home. For those settling on rural homesteads, even their closest neighbor was seldom within walking distance. The conveniences of mail, medical care, and shopping were miles away by horseback. But the determination that brought them west in the first place helped them to endure these hardships. Here women were equal partners with their husbands. Here they enjoyed independence, and many of them accomplished feats never attempted by the sisters and mothers they had left behind. Both Mary Allen of Burlington and Clara Goodhue from Rock Creek operated stagecoach stations along the overland route during the 1860s. Catherine Kaywood of Niwot became the first woman in the county to obtain a cattle brand. After her husband's death, the widow Emma Gould supported her family by operating a boarding house for stone quarry workers in Valmont. A keen awareness by rural women of both their opportunities and responsibilities was evident in their community involvement. It was often they who organized clubs or societies to recapture a sense of family and tradition in their new surroundings. You could find local chapters of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Royal Neighbors of America, or ladies' aid societies in almost every community in the county. These social commitments were second only to the day-to-day management of their households and the rearing of their children. Large families were common, and each child was given chores and responsibilities.
Or do we milk cows and split wood and carried wood, and then very early in our young life we did the regular ranching.
Of course, we had to help with the laundry We had to do our iron, we had to clean our rooms, and that, as most kids did. But the summertime, we would have felt a little bit upset if Dad had hired somebody to help him out there in the field, because we all liked to work with the horses and that, you know.
We used to get up at daylight, pick peas. He'd run the water at night, and then we'd get out in the morning and pick them barefoot because it was mud. I'll never forget the fate of one toad that got in my way. I stepped on it. I never did find that toad. He went so far down in the mud. I don't think he ever knew what hit him.
New ideas in homemaking spread very slowly along the frontier, but that changed in 1862 with the establishment of land-grant colleges. In Colorado, specialists from the Agricultural College in Fort Collins provided homemaking classes for rural women. These eventually became Extension Homemakers Clubs, which met in members' homes. Some chapters remain active in the county today. Prairie grasses were the first harvested crop in Boulder County. A market for hay existed both on the plains and in the gold camps, where mules and horses were used extensively to pull ore carts and mine timbers. Feed from the Boulder Valley was hauled as far as the mining district near Black Hawk and Central City. The round trip via Golden Gate Canyon took about 1 week. Hay to be transported over such long distances was often compressed into large bales, which fit snugly into wagon boxes. Freighters purchased hay from local farmers for as little as $25 a ton. But they charged the mining companies more than 4 times that amount upon delivery. Some enterprising farmers cut out the middlemen and delivered the hay themselves.
Grandfather used to take hay and put it on a sled, just poles, and make kind of a pole sled out of it. Take it up to Black Hawk. And he got $200 a ton for hay up there because for the donkeys and things like that. You wanted to walk in the middle of the street down through Black Hawk and Central City. You didn't want to get along a building because if you looked like you had any money, and they knew he had some because he had sold all the hay and stuff like that. So he'd go down the middle of the street. He'd keep both hands in his pockets. He didn't have a gun in them, but he kept them both in. He run the bluff. George Poor.
Flour, imported from the Midwest, cost the early settlers as much as $16 for a 100-pound sack. It was imperative that wheat be planted locally as soon as possible. The first crop in Boulder County was planted by Henry, Luther, and Sylvanus Wellman. They farmed 640 acres just east of Boulder. The Wellman farm lay at the northeast corner of Arapahoe Road and Foothills Parkway in Boulder, and remains open farmland to this day. With the successful introduction of grain crops, it didn't take long for flour or grist mills to appear in the county. The first was built by Andrew Dowdy along South Boulder Creek. John Davis and his partner followed soon after with a mill beside St. Vrain Creek near Pella. Before long, numerous mills were operating throughout eastern Boulder County.
It was sometime after the year of the hailstorm, and Father had marketed a very good crop. Prices were low, probably 50 cents a bushel for the wheat. It was hauled by team to the elevator at Canfield, about 5 miles. In order to make 2 trips a day, it was necessary for Father to start before daylight, and even then it was dark by the time he finished. Often he would have to wait in line as other farmers hauled their grain there too. Flora Ewing.
It took years for innovations in new farm machinery to reach ranchers and farmers in the western states. Until the 1870s, those in Boulder County continued to use the walking plows they had brought with them years before. With no horse-drawn planters, the Wellman brothers had planted their wheat by hand, walking back and forth across the field with grain sacks slung over their shoulders. And in the fall, they had harvested the grain using a cradle scythe. But within a few short years, mechanical binders were harvesting most of the grain crops in Boulder County. To operate more sophisticated implements, such as hay balers and grain separators, power was supplied with horse-powered treadmills and sweeps. In the 1890s, portable steam engines replaced both the treadmills and the sweeps. These giant engines lumbered into position under their own power, or they were hauled to the wheat fields by teams of horses. Their huge drive belts stretched 75 to 100 feet to reach a grain separator standing nearby. It took up to 14 men to oil the machinery, maintain the fire in the boiler, pitch bundles of wheat into the separator, and to weigh and sack the grain. Every fall, threshing crews traveled through the countryside, harvesting grain on a contract basis. Since everyone's fields matured at about the same time, many crews were needed to complete the harvest. Jerome and Arthur DeBaker threshed east of Boulder. Clyde Bolton operated an outfit near Niwot. The William Birch crew worked around Hygiene, and Arthur Kneebone threshed near Lafayette. These were but a few of the threshing outfits operating in Boulder County in the early 1900s. The farmer's wife and family usually prepared the noon meal for the crew. Dinner at the farmhouse meant that the men could stop at the horse tank to wash off layers of dust and chaff. But often the meal was hauled to the field in a horse-drawn cook wagon. Inside was a wood stove, ice box, cupboards, and long tables with benches to seat the entire threshing crew. Hinged side windows let in fresh air, while screens kept out most of the flies. Various crops were planted in the early years of settlement, but many proved unsuited to the arid western climate. Early snows, low rainfall, drying winds, and late spring frost contributed to frequent crop failures. Then, as if the rigors of Colorado weather weren't challenging enough, hordes of grasshoppers blanketed the county from 1873 to 1875. Years later, when grasshoppers once again descended on the county, homemade hopper dozers were dragged through the fields.
Gus rigged up a deal on buck rakes where he put a piece of tin on the front of the buck rake and make this tin drop down into little tanks made out of water heaters cut into. And then he put oil in these water heaters. And then he'd drive these, hook a team onto the buck rake and drive it through the field, and these flying and hopping grasshoppers would hit this tin, slide down into the oil, and then when he got to the end of the field, you'd take a screen and screen out the grasshoppers and put them in a pile and go back to the other end.
The search for suitable crops continued, from potatoes and corn to vineyards and orchards. By 1890, There were 500 acres of fruit crops in Boulder County, with more being added all the time. Farmers claimed record harvests for grapes, apples, and berries. Among the earliest fruit growers was John Brierly, who had come west to mine for gold. He eventually settled at the mouth of Boulder Canyon, where he raised a variety of fruits and vegetables. Just north of Boulder, Joseph Wolfe planted vineyards, fruit trees, and fields of strawberries. Women and children were hired to harvest his crops. In the St. Vrain Valley, apple orchards flourished. George Webster raised more than 22 varieties on his farm near Pella. He even made occasional trips to California to purchase the latest hybrid apple trees. In addition, he raised berries, grapes, and vegetables to sell in the gold camps. When the Chicago colonists arrived in 1871, he began selling trees and other nursery stock to the new residents of Longmont. Anxious to establish an agricultural economy for the Chicago colony, Henry Emery approached several wealthy Denver businessmen with a proposal. He knew of a failing sugar beet factory back in his home state of Illinois. The equipment, he told them, could be purchased and brought west for $50,000. But lacking his vision, they turned him down. By the turn of the century, however, sugar refineries had been established in Grand Junction and Loveland. Then in 1903, the beet industry finally arrived in Boulder County. Great Western Sugar Company opened a sugar refinery in Longmont, 32 years after Henry Emery had first proposed the idea. Company agents traveled through the countryside, contracting with farmers to plant beets. At first, many signed on for only a few acres. Because migrant labor was not present at the turn of the century, farmers were dependent upon their families to thin and cultivate the beets.
The rows were about a half a mile long, and it just seemed like it would take forever to get down to the other end. It was hot, very hot. Mother was out there with us, but Dad said about 11 o'clock, "You better go home, Mother, and make dinner." Generally, we would eat in 30 minutes, but Dad would give us a break of 15 more minutes, and then we'd be out in the beet fields again. And this went on until the whole field had been thinned.
As farmers planted larger fields of beets, their families were unable to keep up with the added work. Laborers were hired to do the thinning, cultivating, and harvesting. Because coal mines in the Louisville and Lafayette area closed during the summer months, many laborers were local miners and their families who welcomed the seasonal beet work.
We always hired the Italians from Louisville, and they did our beets for several years out there. We did have a house for them, and they stayed out there because they didn't have the facilities to go back and forth into Louisville, you see.
The beet houses were primitive at best, with no indoor plumbing and often no electricity. October was harvest time, and beet wagons could be seen on every country road heading for the nearest beet dump along the railroad tracks. Empty beet cars were parked on side tracks at most major rail crossings, waiting to be picked up by the Great Western Sugar Company train. If the beet car was gone when a farmer arrived at the dump site, he left his load piled on the ground to be loaded at a later time. At some of the busier locations, wooden ramps were provided where beet wagons could be emptied directly into the boxcar below.
And then they had a thing there that tipped the whole wagon over on its side, and the beach just rolled out. And the first time you took a team over there, they was pretty spooky. They got used to it. But every time I was up on top there, it seemed like a train had, or an engine or something had to come along.
Both world wars caused severe labor shortages for the bead industry as farm boys left to join the armed forces. In an effort to sustain the industry during these periods, Great Western Sugar Company built dormitories near their sugar mills to house temporary laborers. In 1943, about 200 Italian prisoners of war were brought to Longmont from a camp in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, to help with the fall harvest. In 1944, German prisoners were housed in the dormitories. The first tractors were designed to plow large fields. Because of their immense size, they were unable to maneuver in smaller fields, so most farmers continued to use their horse-drawn equipment. In the 1930s, when smaller models were introduced, farmers still hesitated to give up their draft teams.
I will tell you the hardest fight we had. That was to convert farmers to use tractors for work other than plowing. Because it was an introduction into the mechanical age. Mm-hmm. It was taking a farmer from behind a walking plow and putting him into a tractor seat and turning him loose with a piece of equipment hooked to a drawbar, which was behind him, and started down the field, and he was scared to death.
During the Second World War, farm machinery was rationed, and farmers waited months for their turn to buy a tractor. When their names were finally called, they were encouraged by the implement dealer to trade in their horses and harness. John Murphy kept his trade-ins at Bose's barn in Longmont and at the Jerosa barn near Erie until they could be sold. Most were purchased by the Zang, Tivoli, and Coors breweries to haul beer wagons.
I was the last one in the country to have to get a tractor. And I got mine in the winter or fall of 1944. Traded 5 head of horses. Steel wheels on. And I come home, I couldn't do as much work with that as I could with the horses. So Bud cut the wheels down. And he got the rims and put the tires on, and then, well, it was a tractor after that.
The progress of agriculture in Boulder County is measured every year at the county fair. The first fair, organized in 1868, was sponsored by the Boulder County Agricultural Society. The 4-day event took place in Boulder on 40 acres southwest of Valmont Road and 30th Street. There, a pavilion housed displays of women's handiwork and exhibits of agricultural and mining products. Prized cattle, sheep, and horses were exhibited on the west side of the fairgrounds. The main attraction for many was the grandstand, where fine horses demonstrated their speed and endurance. Horses played an important role on the farm, from the draft team working in the fields to the driving team which pulled the family carriage. Great emphasis was placed on their quality, and improvements in their breeding far exceeded that of any other farm animal. In 1874, the Agricultural Society changed its name to the Boulder County Industrial Association. Greater emphasis was placed on horse breeding and rock drilling events. In an effort to restore its original focus, the Northern Colorado Agricultural Society was formed and purchased 80 acres for a new fairground in Longmont. On the advice of county extension agents, more farmers were appointed to the county fair board, and the emphasis on horse racing declined. A combination of the Depression and a prolonged drought closed the fair for much of the 1930s. But by 1960, it was again so popular that all the exhibit buildings in Longmont's Roosevelt Park were filled to overflowing. It was obvious that a larger site was needed. The county purchased the Afalter Farm at Hover and Nelson Roads. There, a grandstand, an exhibit hall, and livestock buildings were erected. The new facility opened in 1978. Today, livestock judging and 4-H projects remain an important part of the fair. Folks still enjoy horse shows, calf roping, and rodeos in the grandstand. And from one corner of the fairground, the sounds of vintage tractors and steam engines can be heard. Farmers and city dwellers alike are drawn to the yesteryear exhibits to view farming as it used to be. But what about the future? Settlers continue to pour into the St. Vrain and Boulder valleys, but the county's economy is no longer based on agriculture. Acres of valuable cropland are disappearing as vintage farmsteads give way to subdivisions and business parks. Slow-moving tractors, which once traveled down deserted back roads, now compete with commuters who are often annoyed by farm equipment blocking their way. Crops dependent upon irrigation must now share water with thirsty communities on the plains. Of the original 24 granges established in Boulder County, only 4 remain active today. Left Hand Grange in Niwot, Pleasant View Grange on 95th Street, Altona Grange on Nelson Road, and the Crescent Grange in Broomfield. In recent years, however, Boulder County land use policies have been developed to encourage preservation for our remaining agricultural heritage.
I feel a lot more optimistic about the future of agriculture in Boulder County now than I did 10 years ago. A lot of the county programs and statewide programs are really giving incentive to keeping land in agriculture. The county has started out with purchase of conservation easements, which is also purchase of development rights, which is simply paying the landowner a differential price between agricultural productive land versus what you could sell it for as development.
The state, too, honors many farms and ranches with Centennial Farm Awards each year. The Colorado Historical Society, in cooperation with the State Fair and the Colorado Department of Agriculture, has recognized 18 Boulder County farms which have remained in the same family for at least 100 years. They include the Montgomery Farm northwest of Lafayette, the Mayhofer Farm east of Louisville, the Skates Ranch on Magnolia Road, and the McCaslin Farm south of Hygiene.
Lived in a wonderful time. I can remember faintly some people traveling with horse and buggy and walked on the moon.
I don't know. I suppose if I had my life to live over again, I'd just do the same thing I done.
afternoon dinner. That's something we look forward to, and all the neighbors got together, and really a neighborly event every year. So that's Stuart Anderson and all his helpers up there on the Case steam engine this morning. Going to run Harvey Nelson's Belleville separator over there. And it looks like